Alison Johnson wasn't able to join us today, unfortunately, so we have Mark Ruskell with us today. Thank you very much and welcome, Mark. Great to have you. The event will be chaired again by Alistair Dalton from the Scotsman. Welcome, Alistair. And before we get properly started, I'll go through some of the Zoom protocols again. I'm sure you've all seen them by now before, but just for anyone who's new to this event, I'll just share this. So please make sure that you're on mute when you're not speaking. Most of the questions will probably be asked by Alistair Dalton himself, just so we can get through as many of them as possible. But if you are called on to speak, please introduce yourself before speaking and then pass back to the chair once you've finished speaking. You're very welcome to use the chat function though, for any comments, any additional questions. If you have a question, if you put a Q before the question, that helps us see them and pick up on them and makes it more likely we'll ask them. And then, slide doesn't seem to be working again. But we are also recording this call and we will be publishing it online afterwards. And I think that's it. And with that, I'll hand over to Alistair.
Thanks very much, Marie. And as you mentioned, I'm Alistair Dalton, the transport correspondent of the Scotsman. And it's my pleasure to welcome today the Scottish Greens. And as Marie mentioned, it's the fourth of 5 Moving the Vote events. And taking the stand is Mark Ruskell, who is the party's spokesperson for climate and environment, among other things. And he's also a Mid-Scotland and Fife List MSP. Now, Mark is also heavily involved in transport. He helped establish the Fife Rail Forum. He's conducted bikeability training in schools, helped to negotiate free bus travel for the under-22s in the latest Scottish budget. And he has also attempted to introduce default 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in built-up areas across Scotland. Now, in return for supporting the SNP budget, the Greens have been successful in getting the Scottish Government to increase its active travel budget to £115 million, a level unthinkable only a few years ago, but some would say not nearly enough. And the party also has some hugely ambitious transport plans, which we'll probably hear about, including a £6 billion rail tunnel under the Forth. Now, Mark has been an MSP since 2016 and previously in Parliament again between 2003 2007, with a spell in between as the first Green on Stirling Council. He started out studying sustainable agriculture. He's managed various community development projects and has worked in the renewables and conservation sectors. Now, in a moment, I'll ask Mark to summarise the Greens' transport priorities, even though it's unfortunately still 5 days before the party's manifesto launch. But first, I'd like to introduce Transform Scotland's expert panel, who I'll be bringing in to respond to the answers that Mark gives to questions. So first of all, our bus expert is Eleanor Ross, who is Commercial Development Manager for First Bus Scotland. Welcome, Eleanor. For rail and road building, I'll be going to Paul Tetlaw, who is Transform Scotland's Policy Forum convener. Hello, Paul. Walking, wheeling and cycling will today be dealt with by Helen Todd, who is Campaigns and Policy Manager for Ramblers Scotland and another member of Transform Scotland's Policy Forum. Greetings, Helen. And our fourth panellist on demand management and road pricing is fellow Policy Forum member Roger Humphrey. Hi, Roger. So I'll ask Mark, I'll start by asking Mark to set out his stall on transport in no more than 5 minutes, please. When you hear the alarm, you'll know it's time to wind up and we'll go to questions. So over to you, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much, Alistair, and great to see some familiar faces here today. Yeah, apologies from Alison Johnston. Unfortunately, and rather ironically, she fell off her bike last Friday. She's okay, but she's getting surgery today. We did tell her not to go on the Danny McCaskill log jump, but there's no telling her these days. So, so she is where she is. But anyway, I mean, any one of us, any one of the 5 Green MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, as were, would have been happy to step into this event today, because creating a more accessible society with sustainable transport at its heart is very much in the DNA of the Scottish Greens. We see it as absolutely essential to creating a society based on well-being, that we have low carbon transport, we have accessible transport that is inclusive to everybody in society, and also transport and accessibility options that promote our health, both our physical and our mental health, as well as creating strong economic opportunities and community well-being. So that's our vision. That's what drives us. In practical terms, what this means is that over the last 5 years in Parliament, we've been working both inside the Scottish Parliament and also in our parliamentary regions to try and drive the change. So Alistair already mentioned the priority that we put on budgets, particularly the last 4 budgets with the Scottish Government, doubling the active travel budget from 40 to 80 million, raising it again up to 100 million, and then again up to 115 million in this last year. Also the Local Rail Development Fund, which we put in place, £2 million fund, but that came out of work that I was doing within the region, particularly in Fife, local community campaigns looking for reinstatement of railways, but really struggling to find their way through the transport appraisal guidance process, struggling to build effective business cases for reopening their rail routes. And now that fund has been working away across Scotland, a small fund, but it's really helped to stimulate the debate and the practical business cases for reopening rail routes across Scotland. And then the centrepiece really for the last 2 budget deals that we've had has been free bus travel. Last year, free bus travel for under 19s. This year, we've extended it to under 22s. We'll be calling for it to go further in our election manifesto as well. And once the COVID pandemic means that we can resume back to public transport, that will be getting rolled out hopefully later on this year. But, we've been happy to push for some, strong tools as well. So my colleague John Finney, got the legislature to change the Transport Committee, giving councils the power to introduce workplace parking levy as a key tool for demand management, but also to ensure that we're raising the revenue that can be reinvested back into the infrastructure and facilities that we need for the future. And also John driving the case for a public operator for ScotRail as well. But I think in the next Parliament, we need to really see a step change. I think you only have to look at the climate plan that's just been produced by the Scottish Government and the inadequacies in that in relation to transport. We're chasing huge targets now, 75% reduction in emissions by 2030. That means a complete rethink in terms of the way that we provision transport in this country. And although we have a transport hierarchy, which starts with walking and cycling, moves on to public transport and then the private motor car, in Scottish Government policy, when it comes to budgets, that transport hierarchy is turned on its head. So the First Minister today talked about road traffic reduction, getting a 20% reduction by 2030. But at the same time, the government wants to put over £6 billion into trunk roads like the A9 and the A96. The message there is get in the car. It's not, here's going to be a substantial investment into rail, which is going to provide an alternative. It's about reinforcing existing modes of travel, which I think is the wrong way forward. So we're going to have to make some strong priorities here, some strong changes. That's why my party pushed forward, really as a starting point for discussion, our £22 billion Rail for All, a 20-year vision for rail in Scotland, the discussion piece. And I think it's brought a lot of support. It's generated a lot of discussion about individual projects that were in that report. There's a recognition that we need to have this step change in investment and ambition in Scotland. And I think, to go back to the gains that we've made in terms of budgets for active travel, yeah, it's been okay. I mean, it's still just over 3% of the overall transport budget. That's why my party is committing to that walk, cycle, vote campaign commitment to see 10% of transport budgets go on active travel, walking, wheeling, cycling, rising to 20% by the end of the next parliamentary session. And I think that's possible because our colleagues in Ireland, the Irish Greens, are already implementing their role of government there. I can hear a buzzer going, so presumably that's the end of my time. Is that right, Alistair?
Yes, that's right. That's on 5 minutes. Thanks very much for that, Mark. Okay, you mentioned the transport hierarchy being upside down. There's a hierarchy, and the spending is the opposite. First question is from Transform Scotland's director, Colin Howden, who's saying, will the Greens make support for the SNP post-election conditional on a halt and review of the roads programme?
Well, I don't want to jump ahead too much, to be honest. I mean, I'm standing for re-election to get back into the Scottish Parliament. I mean, if we can get a higher percentage vote, if we get more Greens elected, if we can be in a position of more influence, then we'll see where that can take us. I think what we've shown is with 5 MSPs, we're able to deliver some change, but the more MSPs that we have in the Scottish Parliament, the more we'll be in a position where we'll be able to share power, or at least influence the Parliament more significantly when it comes to budget and policy decisions. So, you know, there's no sort of magic formula here, but the maths are that the more Greens that are elected, the more we'll be able to find ways to use that influence in the Parliament. And sometimes that's about working cross-party. You know, we've worked across, particularly, you know, 20-mile-an-hour bill. We work very closely with Labour. We've worked with other parties on other issues as well, with the Scottish Government over workplace parking levy. So in a Parliament of minorities, I think Holyrood will remain a Parliament of minority parties. There are opportunities to work together where you can drive change. But of course, change can be blocked as well. And you can only get through that by having more progressive voices in Parliament.
Thanks for that. Well, I'd like to bring in Paul Tetlow to comment on that. Paul, it sounds a little bit hesitant as far as reviewing or halting road building.
Yeah, there we are, unmuted now. Hello, Mark. Yeah, I mean, happy to hear everything you've had to say and completely agree with you. You'll be interested to know that our 3 other speakers, we've not, so far in these events, we've not had a commitment to halting that big road building programme. We've had talks of reviews, we've had some who, quite frankly, were pretty unaware of where the rail lines ran in Scotland, those parallel to the roads. So it's been a mixed bag. So I guess my questions might elicit a similar answer from you, but just how are you going to turn on its head to put it the right way up, that transport hierarchy, that transport spending? And what opportunity do you think you might have to work with other parties on that? I mean, do you sense a sympathy amongst fellow MSPs in other parties that we might be able to tackle that one? That's me finished, Alistair.
Yeah. I think there are some. So the simple answer is yes. I do want to see major trunk road projects like the A96 abandoned, and that's quite clear. I think the question is, how do you get to that point? And the problem that we've seen with transport planning over many decades is that institutionally it is being driven often by engineers within Transport Scotland at a very high level, who have that background, who have that demand management background. And so I think there are bigger questions. It's not just about the politicians. It's about challenging the structures. It's about challenging Transport Scotland and institutional culture and the transport appraisal guidance and the funding arrangements we have around city deals, for example, to ensure that we're ensuring consistency and coherency in application of that transport hierarchy across all policy and spending. The difficulty we've got is that many of these trunk road programs have existed on the drawing board for many, many years. They're deeply entrenched in institutional thinking, be it, you know, regional transport partnerships or Transport Scotland or councils or wherever. So trying to challenge that and trying to redirect spend into a different way forward is challenging. I'm not going to lie, and I think, to be honest, ministers find that quite challenging as well. But we can do it, and I think, you know, the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland and their recent report, I think, was the first really significant report from a government established commission to say, don't build more of this kind of infrastructure, think about the carbon aspect of it, and maintain the infrastructure that we've already got. So, and I think that has been significant, and I think there are those within the cabinet and the existing government who get that, but I think there are those who don't as well.
Okay. A related roads question, and I'll bring in Roger to respond. But first of all, Mark, this is from Chris Day about particular types of vehicles. He's saying that the BBC reports that 3/4 of SUVs in the UK are sold to town and city dwellers. And given their size, pedestrian safety and carbon impacts, Chris reckons they're inappropriate for urban settings. So how would the Greens deal with that? Is banning them an option?
Well, I mean, I suppose the question would be where would you draw the line in terms of, you know, style of vehicle or anything else? I mean, I think there's certainly fiscal measures that can be introduced in relation to the carbon emissions from a certain vehicle. But yeah, I mean, I think there's culturally something that we need to understand there. Why is it that people are moving towards SUVs? Is it because, you know, there's a perception of safety within our roads, where if you drive an SUV, you think you're safer and you're kind of above the rest of the traffic, and, you know, you're more safe in terms of an impact. But it is a trend that, you know, the car companies have been very successful in exploiting. But I think, you know, the key thing here is about transforming that urban environment so that people feel safe to get outside of the metal box and get on a bike or walk or wheel for those short, you know, 2-mile journeys or longer. And that can only be done if we've got the infrastructure that separates us from the SUVs and the HGVs and the fast moving traffic. And we've also got streets that feel slower and are slower as well. So, you know, build it and they will come. If we create the right infrastructure and the right incentives, people might look at the driveway and think, well, maybe I don't need the SUV anymore because I feel perfectly relaxed, you know, taking another more environmentally friendly option. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, certainly emissions are an issue, and how we regulate emissions, and certainly like to see more low emission zones in Scotland, not just in the 4 cities, but within every air quality management area where we've got problems.
Over to Roger to respond to that, as well as encouraging people out their cars. Should there be more restrictions, Roger?
Well, I think restrictions are bound to be part of demand management. And you mentioned almost the opposite, which is the huge spend. So Mark mentioned the opposite, which is the huge spend on new roads and increasing road capacity. Over the last 20 years, it's been clear that once politically, or once the population gets addicted or used to cheap driving, it's much harder to encourage us politically to shift modes, either as individuals or to support policies, for example, reducing that spending on new roads. What's going on at the moment is there's a huge take-up of electric vehicles, and it's fast, but coming from a small level. It's accelerating. The curve looks roughly exponential. It looks like the transition has taken root. Now, running an electric car is really quite cheap per mile in terms of marginal costs. It's about probably 1/3 of the cost of a petrol car. I find it hard to persuade my family to get the bus when they know how ridiculous the difference is in price between the bus and the electric car. And my family is reasonably environmentally aware. You know, the electric vehicles still bring their external costs to society, even though their CO2 emissions are less than a petrol car. So there's externalities such as public health, safety of children in public spaces, congestion. So if we're to avoid an explosion in traffic due to the increasingly cheap driving costs that come with this transition to electric cars, government is going to have to find some way of using taxation as a form of demand management as a replacement for the fuel tax. And we need to do it soon before people get addicted to that low cost. What plans do the Greens have for a replacement of the current petrol tax in order to prevent a huge growth in the total traffic and also to offset the lost revenue.
So I think that's an important point, Roger. I mean, I'll put my hand up and say, I've got an old second-hand electric car because I live in a rural area, and I need it really for transport. And the costs at the moment are certainly very cheap because you've got a publicly controlled charging network which is free at the point of use. But I'm also aware that it doesn't help with my health. It creates congestion in an urban area. And it doesn't create an environment which is conducive to active travel. So there are downsides of it. I think we need to look at the powers that Holyrood has had, and that's why I mentioned workplace parking levy. There was howls of protests when we introduced that through a budget deal negotiation with the SNP government. But I think we do need to see local leadership on this. Each area will be different. It will have a different pattern in terms of the regular traffic and commuting journeys that people make, particularly to larger workplaces in a regular area, in an urban area. But we need to consider how measures like workplace car parking charging can be introduced, area specific. And I think, we need to go back to considering congestion charging as well. I mean, if Edinburgh put in place its congestion charge, well over a decade ago, it would have had a lot more revenue now to be spending on public transport infrastructure in the city, potentially even enough money to build an extension to the tram line. So, we're coming to a point now where I think we need to put both the carrot and the stick together and say that if we can bring in sensible, proportionate forms of road user charging, we can also then explain where that money can go, and we can look at public priorities for what infrastructure and support would be needed to allow a genuine choice to be made for people to get out of cars and into public transport and active travel.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move on to buses now, and I'll bring Eleanor to respond. But first, Mark, this is a question from Ian Budd of the Friends of the Far North line. In relation to free bus travel for young people. He's saying it will inevitably divert passengers away from rail, which will in turn reduce passenger numbers and weaken the business case for any improvements. How do you propose mitigating this?
So I think this comes down to ensuring that there's proper local planning of our transport needs. And I think both councils and communities have a role to play in that alongside regional transport partnerships. But I wouldn't necessarily see the two as competing. I live in a what I guess you could call an accessible rural area. I'm about 10 miles away from my local train station. There's only really sort of two sustainable ways to get to that train station. One would be I could cycle, and that works some days, but not every day. The other option is to get the bus. So integrating that bus service with the rail network is really important. The problem at the moment is that for anybody wanting to get from my community in the centre of Stirling, it's a £15 return fare, sadly on a first bus, and Eleanor. But and to be honest, I'd be prepared to pay that on the days when I can't cycle. But for many families looking to take 2 people plus children on that trip, it's an exorbitant cost. So there is an issue about accessibility and ensuring that we have a public transport network where it's integrated ticketing, but also where we're able to control some of the costs of that as well. Because at the moment, it's not an easy choice, I think, for people living in rural Scotland. And the default then would be, of course, get in the electric car and drive all the way into Edinburgh, which is something I don't want to do. But on paper, it would be a lot cheaper. So, we need to work on the customer experience. We need to work on reliability and the price, and the integration and the ticketing in order for it to be an attractive alternative to just driving into the centre of Edinburgh with no road user charging or workplace car parking levy when I would arrive there. So you need to stop stacking up the costs and the externalities onto public transport rather than the other way around onto road.
Thank you. And over to you, Eleanor. So free bus travel, is that unfair on the railways?
I mean, we obviously welcome free bus travel to Scotland, and we thank the Scottish Government for looking at introducing it. However, any service that is free is going to have to be paid for some way or another. You know, there will still be the costs of fuel and staff and supplier costs needed in order to run that service, in addition to the additional demand that will be generated. And we've seen that in other European countries where similar schemes are in place, that they've seen 10 to 20% increase in demand because the travel is free. So we are welcoming the discussions with Scottish Government on what the reimbursement rate will be for operators on carrying under 19s, which I think we've got an agreement on now, but moving on to under 22s, and I believe the Green Party are also keen to look at under 26s as well, Mark. So yeah, it is welcomed on our part. I can't comment on rail, despite having worked in rail for a number of years. I'm sure they would love to be able to welcome these under 19s onto their trains as well, if the right reimbursement was there.
Thanks. And a kind of linked question, Andrew Boyd asks, why is free train travel not provided on the same basis as free bus travel? So free for up to 22s on rail as well, Mark.
Yeah, and you could extend that to ferries as well. So, you know, I have to say at first I was a little bit dubious myself personally about whether free public transport works. But I think what we've seen over recent years is, you know, successful implementation of it, particularly in Europe. You know, great success in Estonia, and I personally have become more convinced about this going forward. I think the point Eleanor raises is an important one about what that fare box income is. I mean, it can't be the case that the bus companies run these schemes at a loss. So I absolutely take on board the need for that negotiation with Transport Scotland to be a fair one when it comes to the bus companies. But yeah, the issue here is certainly, I think, around young people, perhaps who are starting in employment for the first time. They may be paid not even the living wage, but the minimum wage. And if they're spending the first hour or maybe even 2 hours of their working day just paying for the transport to get in to their workplace or college, you know, that's a huge burden. And I think for families having to pay multiple tickets, that's a problem as well. But yeah, I think the principle is a good one. I think it can be extended over time. And I think, yeah, you know, connecting people to those economic opportunities, including, you know, shopping in the center of town or getting access to education or job opportunities, I think helps to grow, or helps to sustain the economy that I think we want to see.
Thanks. And Paul, could I just ask you briefly to comment about whether you think free rail travel on the same basis as bus travel is feasible or affordable?
It's affordable if there's a will to do it. I mean, it needs a will within government and within Parliament. And if it can be applied to bus travel, why can't it be applied to rail travel? But I mean, I would go back to the point that Mark was making about we need to move forward with greater integration of ticketing and public transport modes generally. And I think, I assume you would agree with that, Mark, because public transport as a whole competes with the car. That's the competition, not between different modes of public transport. And as somebody else has said and written more than once, two ailing animals fighting one another won't make them any better. So let's understand where the competition is. Okay, over to you, Mark.
Thanks. And yeah, Paul, if you could mute again, because there's a slight interference on your line. That's lovely. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about walking, active travel, wheeling, cycling. There's a question from Ian McCall of Pass for All, and I'll ask Helen to respond once Mark's commented. Ian's asking, what will the Scottish Green Party do as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic to lock in the current increased interest in walking, wheeling and cycling?
Yeah, so I think, to go back to the points around infrastructure, I'm a firm believer that if you build it, they will come. But I think there's more that's needed alongside that as well. So, increase work with employers, infrastructure and facilities where people work, be it shower facilities, be it programs to encourage and support people to get into cycling and commuting. Increased rollout of bikeability in schools. All of those measures are important if the infrastructure is there and if the choice is there. We can build on that. I live, as I said, near Stirling, and we've got a great, cycle hub at the station, which has been really, really successful in terms of turning people on to the options around cycling in the area for leisure, but also for commuting. They've allowed people to try out electric bikes. They've supported people. They've worked with a local social enterprise that repairs and recycles recycle bike, and they're doing fantastic work in schools and in communities and with excluded groups. So all of this is possible, but you need to have that basic infrastructure in place to build on that. I do think, though, if you're talking about money, that it's about how we direct the funding as well as just providing the kind of funds that we've seen up to now being administered through Sustrans. So, the town centre regeneration funds that are coming through now, which there's going to be a lot of interest about post-COVID, because we're seeing now our high street empty. There's going to have to be a lot of creative thinking about how we fill those spaces, but also redesign and repurpose those spaces. That should have walking, wheeling and cycling and mobility at the heart of a lot of those town centre regeneration schemes going forward. And of course, we have had some experimentation through spaces for people as well. Some of that money that I think we delivered through the £110 million, £100 million was spent on spaces for people. And that's allowed, some thinking around how we reorganize space, although it's been problematic in terms of, how that's been rolled out in some areas. But what we have the clear opportunity to do right now is to say, okay, post-COVID regeneration, what do our places actually look like? How do they feel? How do we start to reclaim some of that road space to make our town and city centres far more attractive places to actually linger and to stay in and to spend money in? And at the moment, we have spaces which really exclude people. They're not spaces you want to spend any time in. So I think there's some innovative thinking we can do there around town centre regeneration post-COVID. There's a lot we can do there. And once we've got the infrastructure, to build on all the kind of behavioural change and support that's associated with that.
Thanks. Helen, how does that sound to you? Is that enough to lock in this growth in walking, wheeling and cycling?
Well, I think the Greens have always had a very strong position on active travel, and obviously it's really welcome what Mark's been saying, and especially money is important, and the walk, cycle, vote pledge of 10% would be great, 20% even better. I think it's obviously I stay in Edinburgh, so I'm very much aware of what's happening in urban areas, but I do have concerns, and I don't know, Mark, maybe you know more about this, how this funding for active travel is being spread throughout the country, because it seems it's easier to things which will help a lot of people in cities, but as you mentioned, rural areas, if you're 10 miles from a station, that's probably a pretty horrible road to cycle on if it's not got many cyclists on it. But it is doable, especially if you have an e-bike. So I just wonder if you feel that the funding, the sort of efforts for active travel are being properly spread, especially around rural areas.
Well, I think there's some spending that has gone into rural areas. I mentioned the walk, cycle, vote hustings. I was involved a number of years ago with a very creative scheme in Dunblane. But yeah, you've still got the issue about smaller towns and villages then connecting in over safe routes. And I think the National Cycle Network is significant. I'm still waiting for a section of it to be completed near here, unfortunately. But we do need to focus on really talking to people in rural communities, finding out what the barriers are. Is it about a particular junction which is problematic? Is it about a particular busy road? Are there more rural roads that are running alongside the main arterial routes that could be designated as one of these designations for sort of a slower speed limit, 40-mile-an-hour speed limit for walking, cycling, adequate signage, proper education of drivers. There's a whole suite of options, I think, to support people in rural communities, but it does need the focus, and it does need probably the council to be working with community councils to go in and say, well, look, how can we make this community more friendly for active travel? And doing some of that development work on the ground to look at pinch points, to look at areas which put people off and what changes could be made to encourage people. But I mean, I think one of the things here as well, I mentioned speed. We're about half an hour and I haven't mentioned the 21-hour bill yet. But, I think, again, just simple changes, signaling within every urban street, every residential street where we walk, live and play, that the speed limit is an appropriate speed limit for the 21st century of 20 mile an hour, I think would send a very strong signal if that can be done nationally. And certainly when, I heard that the Welsh government were going down this route, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, was very clear that he saw a measure like this as not being just for Cardiff and the big urban conurbations. He wanted to see every single village in Wales have a safer 20 mile an hour speed limit. That's the national vision that they had in Wales. I was very pleased to go down to Wales when I was promoting my bill here in Scotland and discuss with Assembly members there about how they might approach it, and delighted that they've effectively taken my proposal and are now delivering it as a government. It's just a shame the Scottish government hasn't done it here, but that can make a difference for rural people as well.
Thanks. Now, Mark, you mentioned the Scottish government, or the SNP's pledge to cut car use by 20% by 2030, and policy they actually announced, I think, back in December. Sally Hinchcliffe of Petrol on Parliament would like to know, how do you see the Scottish government in the next term achieving that 20% reduction in driving in practical terms?
So I think it's really hard. I think at the moment, within what I see within the Strategic Transport Projects Review that came out recently, what I see within National Transport Strategy and what's coming through for the Scottish Government, I see a transport policy based on investing in more of everything. So more roads, a bit more investment in rail, a bit more investment in active travel. There doesn't seem to be a clear kind of choice here. Doesn't seem to be a clear decision tree for where we put investment. And I think it sends out mixed messages to the public. And I think what we need is clear choices. Now, I mentioned earlier about where I live. There's a lot of people in my village who will not see getting the bus as a clear choice because of the cost, because of issues with integration with rail. And we need to get to a point where leaving the car at home becomes the clear and the obvious choice. At the moment, it's not. So until we get to the point where that's in place, it's going to be very hard to slow down and then reverse traffic growth. We had the Road Traffic Reduction Acts that were brought in the 1990s. I can remember as a student campaigning for them up in Aberdeen. And there was a strong sense then that things were going completely the wrong direction. Road policy was going the wrong direction in the mid-90s. There was a lack of investment. We had deregulation of buses, 10 years before that. But we've got an opportunity now with the climate crisis to really focus minds, and particularly with COVID as well. People are thinking differently about travel patterns, about balancing home working with commuting. There maybe are decisions about whether people need cars at all, given that new balance. So, ideas and thinking is up in the air at the moment, and there's a clear opportunity here to send the right signals, to invest in the right choices, which then people can then consider. And if we can make that accessible for all people, then I think then we'll start to see the reduction in traffic growth. But at the moment, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen just through willing it to happen or saying that that's our objective. It has to happen by having these practical choices put in place.
Roger, do you want to make a quick comment on that?
Not really. I mean, I think I agree with the overall picture, which is that until it becomes a clear choice as to which bits of transport are invested in at the expense of others, we're still going in the wrong direction. All I hope for is that these enlightened voices from Transform and all the other bodies make their way through to Parliament.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 15 minutes left, so if you have a question, particularly on an area we haven't covered, do put it in the chat box. Make sure you put the letter Q : before, so we can spot that easily. So we can try and get some other things raised. Interesting question from Tricia Fort. She's saying, do the Greens have any plans to improve on the once-in-a-lifetime driving test? No measurement of driving competence in a lifetime does not make for a safe system on our roads. I know this is obviously reserved to the UK government currently.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that would be in our manifesto for Holyrood, but I think it's an interesting point. We've gone from a situation where I think if you got your driving license back in 1990, as I did, there's no repeat testing, there's no kind of top up. When I look at my driving license, in theory, I can drive all sorts of things, huge minibuses, caravans. Some things that I probably would shy away from driving. So, I think the way that we test and the way that we educate people with safe driving has changed a lot over the years. But there's a need to ensure that the cohort of people who have got driving licenses today continue the upskilled in their understanding. And yeah, I'd be open and interested in ideas about how we do that. I think they're trying to sort of put everybody through an advanced driving test would be quite onerous and difficult, but I think ways to encourage people to increase their learning and experience is only going to bear dividends.
I'm going to move straight on to another question. Tricia Fort has asked to the same person, but an interesting different area. It's on buses, so I'll bring in Alan to respond. Tricia's asking, how will you persuade bus companies to provide social routes, routes we need to get everyone from their home to where they need to get to? And should bus lanes in cities operate for much longer periods of the day, perhaps even 24 hours?
Firstly, I would love to say, oh, sorry, Mark. I thought Alistair was bringing me in there. Apologies.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Mark first.
I mean, this is a tension. I mean, in my time as a councillor, we faced diminishing budgets to support lifeline bus services, particularly in rural communities. So subsidising those council services was a real struggle, and I always made the case that we should retain the investment in that. But if we don't have ambitious council subsidy, then my fear is that some bus companies will and I'm sure there'll be a justification for why they want to do this. I have had discussions with First Bus on it, but there will be what I think many people see as cherry picking, which is retaining more profitable routes, letting other routes fall by the wayside, and I think that's a problem. So ultimately, I feel that the move towards bus deregulation in the 1980s was a mistake, that we need to have more bus regulation these days, and we need to have a sensible way forward that ensures that there's a profitable industry, but an industry that is acting exclusively in the public interest in some terms of delivering what it is delivering. And if that means that there's new forms of municipal ownership starting to come onto the scene, fine. That's not going to work everywhere, but it certainly could be part of the mix.
Eleanor.
On the first point, I mean, obviously we would welcome the bus lanes being in operation for far longer, because that would tackle one of the biggest issues faced by our industry, which is congestion. And just speaking about it, 75% actually all the issues faced by bus operators are out with their control, including congestion, cheap parking and stopping patterns. So whilst we recognise there is discussions ongoing about bringing buses back into ownership, what we would say is it doesn't really matter whose name is above the door. There's ultimately still costs that have got to be paid for fuel and mileage and the vehicles and everything else that goes along with providing the bus service, and that won't go away. In terms of the subsidised services, we do operate a number of subsidised services, as Mark spoke about there, and work hand in hand with a lot of the local authorities in providing those, even on ones which aren't profitable to us, but we see that they provide a service that we can balance off against other better performing routes as well. So we do take that into consideration at the moment. However, a lot of the conversation at the moment is around DRT services and mobility as a service schemes, and I think personally that's probably the way a lot of the more rural routes are going to go in terms of a service provision in the future. That's all from me, Alistair.
Thanks, Anna. I want to move on to political scrutiny of transport. Paul Tetlaw is raising the point that in the last parliamentary session, transport was grouped in with rural affairs and scrutinised by the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee, which he said meant limited time and resources for the committee to devote to scrutinising transport, even though it was one of the largest areas of government spending. I certainly quite liked it because, I mean, I didn't have to watch the committee every week. So Paul wants to know, would the Greens support the creation of a separate dedicated transport committee, or at least grouping transport with a more appropriate policy area such as climate change?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it will be for all parties to come together in just a few weeks' time and decide how they're going to cut different portfolios. I mean, it certainly has been a mega portfolio, you know, rural affairs, a rural economy and connectivity, all the transport aspects that are linked into that in one committee. And, you know, I'd sort of go back to my members' bill again, 20 mile an hour. I mean, I think that be sort of kind to the committee. I think quite a few of the committee members did not have an interest in that area of road safety. I'd had to come a very long way in terms of understanding where the bill was coming from, and you had people on the committee who were very much coming from a rural economy, farming background as their primary interests of being on that committee. You're always going to have a balance of expertise and interest according to agendas. I think in the first session, Scottish Parliament, transport and environment was linked together back in '99, I seem to remember. So there are different ways to cut it. But, you know, another way to do this would be to have a climate change committee, to have a net zero committee that has more of an overview of policy, of which transport could be part of that. You know, transport could be linked to the economy as well as it could be linked to the environment, and we'll just have to see. But I think that the critical thing here is how you have government structures like Transport Scotland and ministers that can ensure that there is coherence across government policy. So what you don't want is, you know, a decision being made in one part of government which is contributing to climate change targets, while another part of government is undermining that with policy. So that does require things to be much more joined up, and for the Parliament to scrutinise that in a joined up way. But it is a real challenge at the moment, and I think you know, where transport gets grouped with will be interesting. I guess I'd be interested in your views as well. You know, where you think it should be as transport stakeholders, where you think it should be. You know, what you think it should be grouped in within the next session.
Any of the panel like to quickly respond to that? If not, we'll move on.
There's going to be rough edges because a lot of these issues are so cross-cutting that you know, you can't talk about transport without talking about local government. You can't talk about transport without talking about the economy or the environment. So, you know, how you get that joined up decision-making is hard.
I'm minded to press on to try and get one, if not two more questions, possibly one more question before we have to wind up. But kind of sticking with the political side of things, a question from Dave Defer of Spokes, the Lothian Cycle Campaign, who's asking, do you see changes in the views of other parties towards sustainable transport into the new Parliament? Chris Stark of the Climate Change Committee told the Parliament that current policies are all carrot, but that sticks are also needed. do you think other parties are beginning to recognise this? I'll get Helen to respond, but first Mark.
Yeah, a little bit. And again, it depends on who you speak to, you know, and who is the portfolio holder within each of the parties and what influence they have within their party. I think, you know, everybody likes to talk the talk. Everybody, of course, everybody wants to see more money put into walking and cycling. But the question is how much, and the question is, what are you also doing around demand management for the private car, private vehicles, to tackle the other side of the equation? And I think that's where we get into the, you know, the difficulties and the debate that we had about workplace parking levies. I mean, you know, a pretty mild measure really that would have been introduced, and it can still be introduced by councils in full consultation with local people, restricted in its nature, so, you know, not applying to hospital workers, you know, a measure that could bring in significant investment into public transport options within towns and cities. But the howls of derision we got when, you know, we worked with the Scottish Government to introduce that, from all parties, was quite incredible. And I think that's the danger. You know, we don't want to get into a kind of culture war with the motorists, and yet there are so many political parties that default to that setting, are unwilling to look at what the benefits can be, and just want to class any kind of demand management measure as being punitive and discriminatory. So, like, we do need to have a grown-up conversation about what that appropriate balance is, while recognizing there will be some people where the choice of the motor car is really the only choice that they have at the moment. And until we've actually built the infrastructure and the choices for those people using the revenue that we get through demand management, then it's going to be a difficult conversation. But it requires a level of maturity, and you can have those conversations with some individuals and other parties, but, you know, other times it's just naked politics, and no, we don't want this. This is really bad.
Thanks. Over to Helen for your thoughts on that point.
Yeah, I would agree there. I think certainly we, you know, in terms of the culture wars, that's always very clear in a lot of places where infrastructure is going in, and yet it's quite often shown that it's just loud voices rather than huge numbers behind that. So I think the more that we can demonstrate the public support for the measures which are going in, because at a population level nationally, there is very strong support for you know, better infrastructure for walking and cycling, and the infrastructure does make the difference. You just have to see the 47% rise in cycling this past year, which was just phenomenal numbers, and that's partly due to infrastructure and the lack of cars on the road. So people obviously do want to get out there, and I think the more that we can harness that attitude of showing what the public wants, because obviously politicians respond also to what the public tells them. So let's give those people a voice too.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, unfortunately, just coming up towards the end of the hour, so I'm going to have to wrap things up just now. So I'd like to thank, first of all, our 4 expert panelists, Eleanor, Paul, Helen and Roger, for your thoughts. And many thanks to Mark Ruskell for taking all those questions. I'm sorry we didn't cover all the questions, but I hope we covered the themes that the questioners had raised. So it's all to play for in the election coming up. I would imagine the sustainable transport world would probably would like the fact that the Greens have the upper hand in influencing SNP policy through various budget deals that, as Mark has mentioned, has introduced the workplace parking levy. Whether that will be taken up, we'll have to see. The extending free bus travel to the under 22s and increasing, as I mentioned, the active travel budget to more than £100 million a year. But let's see what where the political dice land after May the 6th. There could perhaps be a majority government that perhaps may be a different type of pro-independence coalition, or perhaps the Greens may find themselves once again in a key role but very interesting to hear Mark's thoughts on where the party sits. So with that, thanks to everyone, and I'll hand back to Marie.
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, well, thanks, Mark, for answering all our questions. I think we've heard some very positive commitments from Mark today, especially the commitment to 10% of the transport budget for active travel, which a lot of people here on this call have been campaigning for, and also the position on road building do stand in contrast to what we've heard from some of the other parties in the past week. I think that's also, you could tell by fewer comments in the chat, getting frustrated possibly, but with the transport sector still being the largest source of climate emissions in Scotland and having been very little progress over the past decades, this is very welcome to hear all of these positive commitments, and we're hoping that, given the Greens' ambition to work with other parties, trusting the polls that they're not entirely incorrect, probably the SNP, we're hoping that the Greens will hold the SNP to account on these issues in the next parliamentary session. And yeah, so thank you for that interesting discussion. Thanks, Mark. We're of course also wishing all the best to Alison, and a quick recovery to her. And thank you, Alistair, for chairing this session again. Thanks to all the panelists for your contributions, and everyone who submitted questions and joined the call today. This was the fourth call in our series. The fifth and last event will be on Friday, the 23rd of April, at the same time, with Michael Matheson from the SNP, and we'd love to see all of you there again. And you'll probably be receiving an email soon with details on how to sign up for that as well. So thank you, everyone. I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.